He was 20 years old when he inherited a kingdom, 22 when he crossed into Asia and began dismantling the greatest empire the world had ever known, 32 when he died, leaving behind a conquest so vast, so bewildering in its speed and ambition that even his enemies could not fully comprehend what had just happened to them. No biography, no legend, no myth has ever quite captured what Alexander of Macedon truly was. Because history, for all its careful documentation, struggles to account for a person who seems to exist outside its normal rules. Tonight, we will try. We will follow Alexander from the wild mountain kingdom of his birth through the Persian heartlands, across the scorched deserts of Egypt, over the Hindu Kush and into India, a journey of over 20,000 miles. We will meet the people who shaped him, feared him, loved him, and ultimately could not hold him. We will watch as he remade the entire map of the known world before his 33rd birthday. But this is not simply a story about war. It is a story about obsession, about a young man raised on the tales of gods and heroes who decided, with absolute sincerity, that he was one of them, about what happens when genius and hunger and the absolute refusal to accept limitation all inhabit the same extraordinary body. Some men conquer kingdoms. Alexander conquered the very idea of what was possible. So settle in, let the day drift away, let the sounds of the modern world grow quiet. Tonight, we are heading east. We are heading deep into antiquity, and we are going to tell this story from the very beginning. To understand Alexander, you must first understand the place that made him. Macedonia in the 4th century BC was not, by any measure, considered truly civilized by the standards of the Greek city-states to the south. The Athenians, with their philosophy and their theatre and their democracy, looked upon the Macedonians with barely concealed contempt. To them, Macedonia was a rough northern backwater, a kingdom of farmers and horsemen and half-tamed nobles who drank too much wine and settled arguments with iron rather than debate. And there was some truth in that characterization. Macedonia was a rugged land, bordered by mountains and forests, its winters long and unforgiving. Its people were hardy and direct in a way that the polished citizens of Athens found alarming. They did not recline at elegant symposia and trade philosophical riddles. They hunted wild boar. They trained from childhood to ride and fight. Their kings ate among their men and drank without ceremony and led their armies from the front. But something remarkable had been happening in Macedonia in the decades before Alexander was born. His father, Philip II, had inherited a kingdom on the verge of collapse when he came to power in 359 BC. The treasury was nearly empty. The army was poorly equipped and had just suffered several humiliating defeats. Neighboring kingdoms were encroaching on Macedonian territory from multiple directions simultaneously. Philip was 23 years old, and many around him expected the kingdom to simply disintegrate. What happened instead was one of the most extraordinary reversals in the ancient world. Philip was not merely a capable ruler. He was a genius of military and political organization. In just a few years, he transformed the Macedonian army from a disorganized collection of tribal warriors into the most sophisticated fighting force the ancient world had yet seen. He did this by inventing, or at least perfecting, an entirely new way of fighting. The weapon at the heart of his revolution was called the sarissa. It was a pike of extraordinary length, somewhere between 15 and 21 feet, far longer than any spear used by the Greek hoplites to the south. When Macedonian infantrymen stood in tight formation and levelled these weapons, the combined wall of overlapping sarissa points was nearly impenetrable. The phalanx, as this formation was called, moved like a single armoured organism across a battlefield. Nothing in the Greek world had encountered anything quite like it. Philip paired this revolutionary infantry with equally revolutionary cavalry. The companion cavalry, as they were known, were the shock arm of the Macedonian military, heavy horsemen who could be launched like a battering ram at precisely the right moment in a battle. The combination of these two forces created a tactical system of extraordinary flexibility and devastating power. The phalanx would hold the enemy in place, pinning them, grinding them, keeping them occupied, while the cavalry swept around the flank and struck the exposed side or rear. Philip also understood something that many rulers of his era did not, that war was politics by other means, and that politics was often more efficient than war. He married strategically, forming alliances through union that would have taken decades and enormous armies to create by force. He bribed where he could, he negotiated where he must, and he fought only when both options had been exhausted or when fighting was simply more efficient than the alternatives. By the time Alexander was born in 356 BC, Macedonia was no longer a vulnerable backwater. It was the rising power of the northern Greek world, expanding steadily, absorbing neighboring territories, and beginning to cast a long shadow over the quarrelsome city-states to the south. Alexander entered the world as the heir to something genuinely formidable, and he seemed to understand this from a very young age. The stories told about Alexander's childhood are almost impossible to separate from the mythology that accumulated around him almost immediately after his death. But enough credible accounts survive to sketch the outline of a quite extraordinary child. From the beginning, Alexander was driven by an intensity that those around him found remarkable and sometimes exhausting. He was competitive in a way that went beyond normal ambition. When he was told as a boy that his father had won another military victory, the story goes that he wept, not from joy, but from frustration, because he feared there would be nothing left for him to conquer. When other boys his age were content to race and wrestle among themselves, Alexander measured himself against heroes, against Achilles, against Heracles, against the great figures of myth and epic whose deeds had been sung for centuries. His mother, Olympias, was a formidable figure in her own right, a princess from the neighbouring kingdom of Epirus who had married Philip in 357 BC. She was intelligent, fiercely protective, and deeply religious, devoted in particular to the ecstatic mystery cults of Dionysus that were common in the northern Greek world. She kept sacred snakes in her chambers. She reportedly told Alexander that his true father was not Philip at all, but Zeus himself, the king of the gods, who had appeared to her in the form of a serpent before Alexander's conception. Whether Alexander believed this story or simply found it useful is a question historians have debated ever since. What is clear is that from childhood he carried within him a sense of divine destiny, a conviction that he was meant for something beyond the merely human. This was not vanity in any ordinary sense. It was more like a burning internal pressure, an engine of ambition that never cooled. His education was, by any measure, extraordinary. Philip was determined that his heir would be not merely a warrior king, but a man of genuine intellectual cultivation. And so, when Alexander was 13, Philip hired the greatest intellectual in the ancient world to be his tutor, Aristotle of Stagira, who had studied at Plato's academy and who would go on to write foundational texts in biology, physics, ethics, politics, rhetoric, and drama. Aristotle and Alexander spent roughly 3 years together in the gardens of Mieza, a quiet sanctuary away from the Macedonian court. What passed between teacher and student during those years shaped Alexander in ways that were both visible and invisible throughout the rest of his life. Aristotle taught him medicine, which Alexander would later practice on wounded soldiers with his own hands. He taught him philosophy, which gave Alexander a framework for thinking about justice, virtue, and the nature of the good ruler. He taught him a love of literature that would never leave him, most particularly a love of Homer. Alexander's copy of the Iliad, annotated by Aristotle himself, became one of his most prized possessions. He carried it with him on campaign for the rest of his life, reportedly keeping it under his pillow alongside a dagger. Achilles was his model, his mirror, the standard against which he constantly measured himself. The swift-footed hero of Troy, who chose a short, glorious life over a long, anonymous one, spoke directly to something in Alexander's soul. But these years of cultivation did not soften the harder edges of Alexander's character. By the time he was 16, Philip trusted him enough to leave him as regent of Macedonia while he went on campaign. During this absence, a Thracian tribe called the Maedi rebelled. Alexander did not write to his father for instructions. He assembled an army, marched against the Maedi, defeated them, and founded a city on the site of his victory, naming it Alexandropolis. He was 16 years old. There is one story from Alexander's youth that has been told and retold so many times it has almost become myth, and yet the evidence suggests it is essentially true. It is the story of Bucephalus, and it tells us something important about the nature of Alexander's genius. When Alexander was about 10 or 12 years old, a horse dealer brought a magnificent black stallion to the Macedonian court, offering it to Philip for an enormous sum. The horse was enormous and spectacularly built, but completely unmanageable. Every rider who attempted to mount it was thrown. Philip's finest horseman could not control the animal. Philip, practical as always, decided the horse was useless and ordered it taken away. Alexander had been watching. He asked his father for permission to try. Philip was skeptical, perhaps amused, perhaps slightly irritated. He agreed, reportedly telling his son that if he failed, he would pay the horse's full price himself. What Alexander had noticed that the adults had missed was that the horse was terrified of its own shadow. Every time a rider approached, the horse was turned toward the watching crowd, and the movement and noise sent shifting shadows dancing across the ground in front of it. The animal was not vicious. It was afraid. Alexander took the horse's bridle and turned it to face the sun, so its shadow fell behind it where it could not see it. He stroked the horse's neck. He spoke quietly. He waited, and when the animal had calmed, he swung up onto its back and rode. Philip wept, according to the sources, and told his son that he must find a kingdom worthy of him, because Macedonia was not large enough to contain him. Whether Philip said precisely that or not, the story captures something real. Alexander had solved the problem not by force, but by observation, by understanding, rather than domination. This combination of fierce will and penetrating intelligence would define his military and political leadership for the rest of his life. The horse itself, Bucephalus, meaning ox head, became Alexander's companion for decades. He rode him at Gaugamela, at Hydaspes, across Persia, and into the heart of Asia. When Bucephalus died in India from wounds received in battle in 326 BC, Alexander founded a city in his honor, calling it Bucephala on the banks of the Hydaspes River. It was a grief that seemed to surprise even those who knew him well, a crack in the armor through which something deeply human briefly showed. At 18, Alexander received his first taste of real battle, and it was not a gentle introduction. Philip brought him to the field at Chaeronea in 338 BC, where the combined forces of Athens and Thebes, the two great city-states of Greece, had assembled to resist Macedonian expansion. This was the decisive confrontation that would determine whether Philip would dominate the Greek world or be stopped by it. Alexander commanded the left wing of the Macedonian cavalry. His target was the Sacred Band of Thebes, the most elite military unit in the Greek world, a force of 300 paired warriors who had sworn to fight and die together. They were undefeated in their history. They were, in military terms, a legend. Alexander broke them. The Sacred Band died where it stood, to the last man, refusing to surrender or flee. Their bones were later found in exactly the formation in which they had fought, a testimony both to their courage and to the completeness of the Macedonian victory. The Battle of Chaeronea made Philip the master of Greece. But it was Alexander's assault on the Sacred Band that ancient historians would remember as the turning point, a moment when something new and unstoppable had announced itself on the battlefield. The relationship between Philip and Alexander was never simple. There were periods of deep mutual admiration and shared purpose, and there were periods of dangerous friction. Philip had other wives besides Olympias, and other children, and as Alexander grew older, the question of succession began to generate real tension at the Macedonian court. The crisis came at a wedding feast in 337 BC. Philip had married a Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra, whose uncle Attalus made a toast at the celebration, calling on the assembled guests to pray that this new union would produce a legitimate heir to the Macedonian throne. The implication was clear and deliberate, that Alexander, born of a foreign mother from Epirus, was somehow not fully legitimate. Alexander hurled his wine cup at Attalus. Philip drew his sword and lurched toward his son, but he was drunk and stumbled and fell. Alexander stood over him and said, according to one account, something to the effect that here was the man preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, unable to cross from one couch to another without falling down. He and Olympias went into exile. The rupture was eventually patched over. Alexander returned. Philip and his son appeared publicly reconciled, but the wound was real and it never entirely healed. Then, in the summer of 336 BC, Philip was assassinated. The murder took place at a celebration in the theatre at Aegae, the ancient Macedonian capital. Philip had just arranged the marriage of his daughter and was walking in a procession between two Alexanders, his son and a friend, when a young Macedonian nobleman named Pausanias stepped forward and drove a sword into his side. Philip died almost immediately. Pausanias was killed before he could be interrogated. The question of who truly ordered the assassination has never been answered with certainty. Ancient sources point in various directions. Some suspected Olympias. Some suspected the Persian court, which had every reason to want Philip dead before he could launch his planned invasion. Some even suspected Alexander himself, though this seems unlikely given his subsequent actions. Whatever the truth, Alexander moved with breathtaking speed. Within days, he had eliminated all plausible rival claimants to the throne. He then travelled south to reassert Macedonian authority over the Greek city-states, several of which had assumed that Philip's death would be followed by weakness and opportunity. Thebes, in particular, was considering outright revolt. Alexander arrived at Thebes with his army before the Thebans had fully decided what to do. His message was simple: submit or face consequences. Thebes chose to fight. Alexander destroyed the city completely. 30,000 Theban citizens were sold into slavery. The city itself was razed to the ground, its walls demolished, its temples emptied. He spared only the house of the poet Pindar, whose work he admired, and the temples of the gods. This was not simply savagery. It was a calculated message to every city-state in Greece. The new king would be generous to those who accepted him and absolute in his punishment of those who resisted. The message was received. Athens sent ambassadors. The other city-states fell into line. At just 20 years old, Alexander was the undisputed master of Greece and Macedonia, and he was already looking east. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander led an army of approximately 40,000 men across the Hellespont, the narrow strait of water separating Europe from Asia. It was the same crossing that Xerxes of Persia had made in the other direction a century and a half earlier when he led his vast army into Greece and burned Athens. Alexander was now reversing that journey, and he was aware of the symbolism down to the last detail. As his ship approached the Asian shore, Alexander threw a spear from the bow into the beach. This gesture declared that Asia was Spear One territory, land claimed by the right of conquest. He was the first to leap ashore when the ship grounded. Then he walked inland to the plain of Troy. At Troy, or what remained of it, Alexander performed a series of rituals that tell us everything about the interior life he carried into this campaign. He and his closest companion, Hephaestion, laid wreaths on the tombs of Achilles and his companion Patroclus, honoring the great hero and his beloved friend, a parallel that Alexander clearly understood and intended. He ran naked around the tomb of Achilles, as was the ritual custom. He declared Achilles fortunate to have had a friend like Patroclus and a poet like Homer to immortalize his deeds. This was not theatre for an audience, or at least not only that. Alexander believed deeply in the weight of mythological precedent. He was not simply fighting a military campaign, he was living an epic. Every battle was also a scene in a story that would outlast the physical world, and he was acutely conscious of how he would appear in the telling. The first major test came almost immediately. The Persian satraps, the regional governors of the western reaches of the empire, had gathered an army along the eastern bank of the Granicus River. They were well positioned, with cavalry massed along the high riverbank above the water. Alexander's generals urged caution. The crossing was dangerous, the current was swift. An attack directly into a prepared position would be costly. Alexander attacked directly across the river. The battle that followed was dangerously close. A Persian nobleman named Spithridates came close to killing Alexander with a blow to the head that shattered his helmet and staggered him. Before a second blow could land, one of Alexander's commanders, Clytus the Black, cut off Spithridates' arm. Alexander owed his life to that intervention, a fact that would have a dark resonance many years later. The Persian cavalry was routed. The Greek mercenaries who had been fighting for Persia were shown no mercy. Alexander had them killed rather than captured, an act of calculated cruelty. They were Greeks fighting against Greeks on behalf of the Persian king, and Alexander wanted to make the moral statement plain. The Granicus was not just a military victory. It was a declaration of intent. The cities of Western Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, had been under Persian control for generations. Many of them were Greek cities, founded by colonists centuries earlier, maintaining Greek language and culture under Persian overlords. As Alexander moved down the coast, many of these cities opened their gates and welcomed him as a liberator. He was careful to present himself in exactly this way, not as a conqueror, but as a deliverer, restoring self-governance and Greek customs and reducing the tribute burdens imposed by Persian administration. Not every city surrendered peacefully. Miletus and Halicarnassus both put up significant resistance, requiring sieges that lasted weeks. Alexander's siege engineers, trained under Philip, demonstrated remarkable technical sophistication, deploying artillery, towers, and undermining operations against fortifications that were considered among the strongest in the region. It was during this sweep through Asia Minor that Alexander made a decision that surprised his advisors. He had a substantial Macedonian fleet, but the Persian navy was much larger and had recently demonstrated its ability to threaten Macedonian sea lanes. The conventional response would have been to build up his own fleet and fight for control of the sea. Alexander disbanded most of his fleet instead. His reasoning was elegant and counterintuitive. The Persian fleet needed port cities to refit, resupply, and shelter. If Alexander conquered every port city along the Mediterranean coast, the Persian fleet would wither and die without ever needing to be defeated at sea. He would conquer the sea from land. It was exactly the kind of solution that came from looking at a problem from an angle no one else had considered. It was also in Asia Minor that Alexander encountered the Gordian knot. In the city of Gordium, there was a famous wagon in the temple of Zeus, its yoke tied with an extraordinarily complex knot of cornel bark. A prophecy attached to this knot stated that whoever could untie it would rule all of Asia. Many had tried, none had succeeded. The story of what Alexander did next exists in two versions. In one, he studied the knot carefully, found the ends that had been hidden within it, and worked it loose by conventional means. In the other, he simply drew his sword and cut it apart. Both stories may be true. Both may be inventions. But what matters is what the story meant to those who told it, that Alexander solved problems by refusing to accept the terms in which they were posed. If the rules of the game prevented a solution, he changed the rules. If a knot could not be untied, cutting it was not cheating. It was simply thinking differently about what the problem required. By late 333 BC, Alexander had received intelligence that the Persian king Darius III was moving his enormous army to intercept him. What followed was one of the most consequential encounters in ancient history. And it almost didn't happen where it did. The two armies actually maneuvered past each other in the dark without realizing it, ending up on opposite sides. When morning revealed the situation, Darius found himself to Alexander's north, cutting off his line of supply. Alexander had been looking for Darius. Now Darius, who had not intended to fight in such constricted terrain, had to fight where he stood. The battlefield at Issus was narrow, hemmed in between the mountains and the sea. This terrain completely neutralized the Persian advantage in numbers. 1,000,000 men in a narrow coastal plain cannot fight as 1,000,000 men. They simply create a crush. Alexander's smaller, more disciplined, more experienced force could fight effectively in the space available. The Persians could not. The battle was decided when Alexander led his companion cavalry directly at Darius himself. The Persian army, enormous as it was, relied on the king at its psychological and organizational center. When Alexander's cavalry smashed through to the royal chariot and Darius could see iron-tipped death coming toward him, the great king turned his horses and fled. The Persian army, seeing their king in retreat, collapsed. The pursuit went on until dark. Darius escaped into the night, abandoning his chariot and his cloak and his bow, symbols of royal dignity that were left for Alexander to collect from the road like shed skin. At the Persian camp, Alexander found something equally striking. The royal household had been captured. Darius's mother, his wife, his daughters, and his young son were all in Macedonian hands. What Alexander did next became one of the most discussed moments of his life. He went to the tent of Darius's captured family and behaved with complete formality and gentleness. He assured the Queen Mother that he had no intention of mistreating them. He allowed them to maintain their royal customs and honors. He addressed Darius's mother with the respect due to a queen. When the Queen Mother initially confused Alexander's companion Hephaestion for the king, because Hephaestion was taller and more physically imposing, and prostrated herself before the wrong man, Alexander reportedly said only that she had not made an error, because Hephaestion was also Alexander. This treatment of the Persian royal family was not merely chivalry, though it was that too. It was politics. Alexander was not simply destroying the Persian Empire. he was gradually, systematically presenting himself as its rightful heir. The man who treated Darius's mother as his own grandmother was not a foreign barbarian pillager. He was a king worthy of the throne that Darius had abandoned. After Issus, Alexander did not chase Darius east into the Persian heartland. He turned south instead, continuing his systematic conquest of the coastline. Most cities surrendered. One did not. Tyre was one of the great merchant cities of the ancient world, the center of Phoenician trade and power. It sat on a small island roughly half a mile from the mainland, its walls rising directly from the sea on every side. It had withstood sieges before. Its citizens were confident. When Alexander arrived and requested peaceful entry to make a sacrifice in the city's famous temple, the Tyrians refused, offering instead a compromise that Alexander found unacceptable. What followed was one of the most remarkable engineering feats in military history. Alexander decided to build a causeway from the mainland to the island, a mole of stone and timber stretching half a mile across open water, wide enough for siege towers and artillery. The work began immediately. The Tyrians found this amusing at first. They sailed out and mocked the Macedonian workers from their warships, throwing things and shouting insults. Then, as the causeway grew and the workers got closer, the mockery became fire ships and naval raids and projectile artillery. The work continued. Men died. The causeway grew. Alexander commandeered Phoenician warships from the cities he had already taken, those whose sailors had no particular loyalty to Tyre and every practical reason to align themselves with the man who now controlled their home cities. He assembled a fleet. He used it to protect the workers and to begin testing the sea walls from the water. After 7 months of sustained siege, with the causeway complete and siege towers positioned against the walls and battering rams working on the sea walls while the fleet kept the Tyrian navy occupied, the walls broke. What followed was brutal. The Macedonians had lost men during 7 months of difficult, dangerous work in the face of a resourceful and determined enemy. Their blood was up. Alexander reportedly ordered that the military-age male population be executed and the women and children sold into slavery. Approximately 30,000 Tyrians are said to have been enslaved. 2,000 men of fighting age were crucified along the beach. The causeway Alexander built to reach Tyre never disappeared. Over the centuries, silt accumulated along its sides. The island of Tyre became a peninsula. You can still see it today on satellite images of the Lebanese coast. The narrow neck of land that connects the old island city to the shore. The ghost of Alexander's engineering, preserved by 2,300 years of geology. Egypt fell without meaningful resistance. The Persian governor surrendered the country to Alexander in 332 BC, and the Egyptians, who had never particularly welcomed Persian rule, received him as a liberator. But Alexander's actions in Egypt went well beyond the merely political. They told a story about who he believed himself to be. He went first to Memphis, the ancient capital, where he made sacrifice to the Egyptian sacred bull, Apis, and was recognized by the Egyptian priests as Pharaoh, the rightful ruler of Egypt, the inheritor of a title that stretched back 3,000 years. This was not simply a formality. The Egyptian priesthood was politically and culturally powerful, and their endorsement mattered enormously both to the Egyptian population and to Alexander's self-understanding. Then he did something that even his admirers found unusual. He organized an expedition to the Siwa oasis deep in the Libyan desert, more than 300 miles from the Nile Valley, to visit the oracle of Amun. This was not an easy journey. It was weeks of travel through some of the most inhospitable terrain in the known world. Several ancient sources record miraculous assistance along the way, a pair of crows or ravens guiding the column when it was lost, a rain shower appearing when the army was dying of thirst. At Siwa, Alexander entered the inner sanctuary alone to consult the oracle. What was said to him by the priest in that dim desert temple, no one ever fully recorded. Alexander told some companions afterward that he had received the answer his heart desired. Ancient writers later claimed the priest addressed him as the son of Amun, or perhaps as the son of Zeus, the Greek equivalent. From this point onward, Alexander increasingly presented himself as the son of a god. Whether Alexander literally believed in his own divine parentage or used the idea as a carefully managed political tool is one of the great unresolvable questions of ancient history. Perhaps the most honest answer is that the distinction between sincere belief and strategic belief was not as clear to Alexander as it might be to us. In the ancient world, the categories were more porous. A king could be the son of a god in a way that was both metaphorically true and literally true simultaneously, without the contradiction troubling anyone. Before leaving Egypt, Alexander founded a new city at a small fishing village on the Mediterranean coast where the Nile Delta met the sea. He designed the basic layout himself, reportedly walking the streets with grain to mark the lines where the roads would run. When birds came down and ate the grain, his seers interpreted this as a good omen. The city was called Alexandria. It would become, within a generation, one of the greatest cities in the ancient world, home to the most famous library in history, a crossroads of Greek and Egyptian and Jewish and Persian culture, a city that would shape the intellectual history of the Mediterranean for nearly 1,000 years. Darius had spent the time since Issus rebuilding his army. He had learned from his previous defeat and had chosen his ground carefully this time, a broad, flat plain near a village called Gaugamela in what is now northern Iraq, where his cavalry and scythed chariots could operate without the cramped limitation of the Issus coastline. He had reportedly had the ground leveled to make it even more favorable. He had assembled an army that ancient sources estimate in the millions, though modern historians suggest something more like 250,000, still outnumbering Alexander's force by somewhere between 3 and 5 to 1. The night before the battle, Parmenion, Alexander's most senior general, a veteran commander who had served both Philip and Alexander and who represented a kind of institutional experience and caution, came to Alexander and suggested a night attack. The darkness and confusion might neutralize the Persian numerical advantage. It was a reasonable military argument. Alexander refused. He would not, he said, steal his victory. He slept so soundly the night before the battle that his commanders had to wake him in the morning. Parmenion, reportedly, did not sleep at all. The battle on the 1st of October, 331 BC, was the most complex military operation Alexander ever conducted. Darius opened with his scythed chariots, armored vehicles with blades attached to the wheel hubs, designed to tear through infantry formations. Alexander had trained his men for exactly this. The infantry opened gaps in their formation to let the chariots pass through harmlessly, then cut down the drivers from behind. The Persian cavalry on the right flank actually broke through and began attacking the Macedonian baggage train. This was a genuine crisis. Alexander held his nerve. He could see that the Persian cavalry's success on the flank had created exactly what he needed in the center, a gap in the Persian line. He gathered his companion cavalry and drove directly for that gap, directly for Darius himself, in a formation later called the hammer and anvil. The phalanx was the anvil, pinning and pressing. Alexander was the hammer. Darius again turned and fled. Again, the Persian army collapsed when its king abandoned the field. The Macedonians pursued until darkness made further killing impossible. The Persian Empire, the greatest state in the world, the inheritor of Cyrus the Great, the kingdom that had humbled Egypt and Babylon and Lydia, was finished as a military and political force. It had taken Alexander less than 4 years from the crossing of the Hellespont. Alexander took Babylon, the largest city in the world, without a battle. The gates were opened to him, and the population greeted him with the ritual attention due to a king. He made sacrifice to the Babylonian gods. He ordered the temples rebuilt that had been damaged or neglected under Persia. He was beginning to govern, not just conquer, and governing required the cooperation of local institutions, local priests, local populations. He took Susa, one of the Persian royal capitals, and found in the treasury a staggering accumulation of wealth. Ancient sources record numbers that are difficult to evaluate but impossible to ignore. Something like 50,000 talents of silver, an astronomical figure representing centuries of tribute collected from a third of the known world. He loaded the silver onto 3,000 camels and 10,000 mule-drawn carts and moved it east toward the next capital. Bucephalus was the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, the city built by Darius the Great and Xerxes to glorify the Achaemenid dynasty. Its palace complex sat on a great terrace of stone, its halls decorated with carved friezes showing the nations of the empire bringing tribute to the King of Kings. It was, by any standard, one of the most magnificent structures in the ancient world. Alexander captured Bucephalus and garrisoned it, but did not immediately destroy it. For months, the city remained intact, while Alexander used it as a base and contemplated his next move. Then, in the spring of 330 BC, at the end of a drinking party, the palace of Xerxes burned. Ancient sources are divided on whether this was deliberate policy or drunken impulse. The most vivid account, told by the historian Diodorus Siculus, describes an Athenian courtesan named Thais suggesting at a symposium that the palace be burned in revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens a century and a half earlier. Alexander seized a torch and led the procession himself. Whether or not this romantic story is literally true, the consequence was real. The palace of Xerxes, the symbol of Persian glory, was reduced to ashes. The great carved columns stood, but the cedar roofs burned and took the decorated chambers with them. The ruins are still there today, still striking, still faintly scorched, the stone pillars reaching toward the open sky of Iran like the fingers of something enormous that has been cut down but not entirely removed. What Alexander thought of this afterward, whether he regretted it or believed it served its purpose, the sources do not clearly record. What is clear is that by this point he was no longer simply a Greek general avenging Persian wrongs. He was something else, something harder to name. He was becoming Persian as much as Macedonian, absorbing the culture and the protocols and the ambitions of the empire he had destroyed. After Bucephalus, Alexander pursued Darius across the Iranian plateau. Darius, fleeing east, was betrayed and murdered by his own noblemen, chief among them a Bactrian satrap named Bessus. Alexander found the body by the roadside, allegedly still warm. He covered it with his own cloak and ordered it sent to Bucephalus for a royal burial. Darius had been his enemy, but also, in a sense, his predecessor, and the dignity of the burial was a statement that Alexander was not a barbarian destroyer of civilization, but a legitimate successor. Bessus had now declared himself the new Persian king. Alexander had no interest in allowing a rival to claim legitimacy and potentially rally resistance. He drove east into the wild territories of Bactria and Sogdia, regions corresponding roughly to modern Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, chasing Bessus and then dealing with the far more difficult problem of guerrilla resistance in some of the most brutal terrain on Earth. The campaigns in Bactria and Sogdia were arguably the hardest fighting of Alexander's career. This was not the open-field battle where Macedonian discipline and Alexander's tactical genius could be decisive. It was an insurgency scattered across mountain valleys and desert plateaus, conducted by local chieftains who refused the kind of decisive confrontation that Alexander was trained to win. Villages he captured one week had risen again by the next. Passes he cleared were blocked again by winter. Supply lines stretched impossibly thin across hundreds of miles of hostile landscape. It was also during these years that Alexander made decisions that alarmed and sometimes horrified his Macedonian companions. He began adopting elements of Persian court protocol, requiring visitors to perform proskynesis, the Persian custom of prostrating oneself before the king. To Macedonians, this was not merely a difference of custom. It was the gesture made before a god, not a man. Several companions refused. The philosopher Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew, who had been traveling with the army as its official historian, was the most vocal objector. Then came the killing of Clitus. At a drinking party in Maracanda, now Samarkand, in 328 BC, an argument broke out between Alexander and Clitus the Black, the same commander who had saved his life at the Granicus all those years earlier. The argument, fueled by wine, turned bitter. Clitus, angry at what he saw as Alexander's increasing adoption of Persian customs and his tendency to take sole credit for victories that had been won by the whole Macedonian army, said things that could not be unsaid. Alexander threw a piece of fruit at him. Then, as attendants restrained Clitus and tried to get him out of the room, Alexander grabbed a spear from one of his bodyguards and drove it through Clitus's body, The remorse was immediate and absolute. Alexander wept for days. He refused to eat or drink. He lay in his tent with the spear still in the wound, staring at the wall, and would not be comforted. His friends and doctors were genuinely alarmed, not just at the killing, but at the state into which it had plunged him. Eventually, it was philosophers and their arguments about the nature of divine anger that roused him. But the event left a scar. He had killed the man who saved his life in a fit of drunken rage, and no amount of rationalization could make that sit easily with someone who had once wept at the courage of the sacred band. In the rugged highlands of Sogdia, Alexander encountered one of his strangest and most discussed decisions. A local chieftain named Oxyates had taken refuge with his family on a nearly inaccessible rock fortress. Alexander besieged it and eventually took it. Among the prisoners was Oxyates' daughter, a young woman named Roxane. Alexander married her. This was startling on multiple levels. He did not need to marry her. She was a captive. He could have made her a concubine, as conquerors routinely did with the daughters of defeated enemies. The marriage was not a political alliance with any established power. Oxyates was a regional chieftain, not a king. Ancient sources suggest the simplest explanation, that Alexander genuinely loved her, or at least was genuinely captivated by her. The wedding was conducted, according to ancient custom, by sharing a loaf of bread cut with a sword, a simple ceremony without the elaborate Greek formalities. To Alexander's Macedonian commanders, who had hoped he would marry a Macedonian or Greek noblewoman and produce a clear successor, the marriage was another troubling sign of how deeply Eastern he was becoming. But the question of what Alexander actually wanted in his private life is one of the most fascinating and most genuinely uncertain aspects of his story. The ancient sources agree, more or less, that his closest emotional attachment throughout his life was to Hephaestion, his childhood companion, his second in command, the man he had honored at Achilles' tomb at the very beginning of the campaign. The relationship between Alexander and Hephaestion was the central human relationship of his adult life. Ancient writers described them in terms that clearly drew on the parallel between Achilles and Patroclus, the great friendship of the Iliad that Alexander had always held as his model. Whether their relationship was physically intimate in the modern sense is something historians debate and the ancient sources coyly decline to state directly. What is beyond question is that Hephaestion was the person Alexander trusted most completely, the only person with whom he seems to have been entirely himself, without the weight of kingship and divine destiny and performance. He had Hephaestion appointed as Chiliarch, the second most powerful office in the empire, essentially making him co-ruler. He wrote to Hephaestion more frequently and more personally than he wrote to anyone else. When they quarreled, as they occasionally did, Alexander was miserable until they reconciled. The bond between them was, in every observable way, the most important relationship in Alexander's life. In 327 BC, Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush Mountains into India, entering territory that the Greeks considered the edge of the known world. Aristotle had taught him that India was a relatively small country at the eastern margin of Asia, beyond which lay the great encircling ocean that bounded all the earth. In Alexander's mind, reaching India meant approaching the literal end of the world. He was wrong about the geography, as it turned out. India was not a small country at the edge of things. It was a vast subcontinent with a civilization of enormous sophistication and complexity. But Alexander did not know this when he crossed the mountains, and the combination of genuine ambition and genuine geographical ignorance drove him forward. The campaign in India began brilliantly. The great fortress of Ionos, which ancient tradition said even Heracles had failed to capture, fell to Alexander's siege engineers after a brilliantly conducted operation. Local kings either submitted or were defeated. The army was still functional, still disciplined, still, just barely, willing to follow their king to the ends of the earth. The battle at the Hydaspes River in 326 BC against the Indian king Porus was perhaps Alexander's finest tactical performance. Porus commanded war elephants, animals that the Macedonian horses refused to approach. The elephants could not be charged. They could not be frightened. A conventional cavalry attack was simply impossible. Alexander solved this by moving a large force across the river at night in a rainstorm, several miles upstream from where Porus was watching. By dawn, the Macedonians were on the same side of the river as Porus, but in a position he had not anticipated. The battle that followed was the most complex Alexander ever fought. The phalanx engaged frontally. Archers specifically targeted elephant handlers. Cavalry worked the flanks. The infantry opened ranks to let the great animals pass through, just as they had against the scythed chariots at Gaugamela. Porus himself was wounded but refused to flee. He continued fighting from his elephant until his wounds became too severe. When he was finally brought before Alexander, the Macedonian king asked him how he expected to be treated. Porus answered that he expected to be treated like a king. Alexander not only spared him, but made him an ally and allowed him to continue ruling his territory as a Macedonian vassal. It was one of Alexander's most elegant political gestures, a recognition that a man who fought with such determination deserved something better than humiliation. But beyond the Hydaspes lay the Ganges River Valley and kingdoms that scouts reported were even larger than anything Alexander had yet faced. The intelligence suggested armies of enormous size, cavalry and infantry, and thousands more war elephants. The Macedonians had been campaigning for 8 years. They had marched thousands of miles from home. They were tired in a way that went deeper than the body. At the Hyphasis River, the army stopped, and for the first time in his life, Alexander could not move them. It was Conus, one of Alexander's most loyal and experienced generals, who spoke first, but he spoke for all of them. He told the king that the men were exhausted, that their bodies were worn, that their boots had worn through on the roads of Asia, and their armor had been repaired so many times it was more patch than original metal, that they wanted to go home, that they had wives and children and parents they had not seen in nearly a decade, that they had followed him farther than any army in history had followed any king, across deserts and mountains and rivers that had no names in any Greek map. Alexander was furious. He retreated to his tent. He stayed there for 3 days, hoping that the army would change its mind, that the impasse would somehow resolve itself. It did not. When he emerged, he announced that he had consulted the omens and the gods had not approved an advance. He turned the army around, but he wept. The sources are clear on this. He wept at the Hyphasis River, not in grief exactly, not in the ordinary sense of the word, but in the particular despair of someone who can see the horizon of their ambition and cannot reach it. He had come so far. The world was so large. He had believed it finite and discoverable, and now the intelligence reports from beyond the Hyphasis were making it terrifyingly clear that India was not the edge of anything. The world just kept going. He built 12 great altars on the eastern bank of the Hyphasis, monuments to the 12 Olympian gods, marking the furthest point of his advance. They were intended as a message to posterity. Here we came. Here is where the world and the will of men reached their limit together. The altars are gone now, lost somewhere in the floods of the Punjab over 2 millennia. But the moment they marked was real enough. The journey back was brutal in ways that the advance had not been. Alexander led part of his army south through the Gedrosian Desert, the Makran of modern Pakistan and Iran, in part to accomplish a logistical mission, and in part, perhaps, because Cyrus the Great had tried to cross it and failed, and Alexander could not resist attempting what a great predecessor had found impossible. The crossing was catastrophic. Heat and thirst and starvation killed men who had survived the battles of Gaugamela and the Hydaspes. There was almost no water. The army's wives and children and camp followers died in the thousands. One night, a flash flood in the desert, that peculiarly vicious danger of arid mountains, swept through the sleeping camp and drowned many who had survived everything else. Alexander crossed the Gedrosian Desert, but the crossing nearly destroyed the army that crossed it. In Ecbatana, in the autumn of 324 BC, Hephaestion fell ill. It may have been typhoid fever. He was recovering, or seemed to be recovering, when he disregarded his doctor's orders and ate a full meal and drank a large quantity of wine. Within hours, he was dead. Alexander's grief was beyond anything those around him had ever witnessed from a human being, let alone from a king. He threw himself on the body and wept for hours. He ordered the manes and tails of all the cavalry horses shorn as a sign of mourning. He tore down the battlements of the nearby city, an act of violent grief with no practical purpose. He reportedly refused to eat or drink for 3 days. He sent to the oracle at Siwa asking whether Hephaestion should be honored as a god or as a hero. The oracle replied as a hero. Alexander ordered a funeral pyre constructed in Babylon on a scale that has no parallel in ancient history. A stepped structure reportedly 200 feet high, decorated with hundreds of golden ships and burning torches and statues and painted images, costing an amount equivalent to the annual revenue of a substantial kingdom. Whether this structure was actually built to these specifications, or whether the description is an ancient hyperbole expressing the magnitude of the loss, is unclear. What is clear is that Alexander intended it. He threw himself into activity afterward, planning and executing a campaign against tribes in the Zagros Mountains, possibly as a way of working through the grief in the only language that had ever been able to absorb him entirely. But something had changed. Those who knew him well noticed it. The burning certainty that had always characterized him seemed not extinguished, but somehow different, banked rather than blazing. The man who had always seemed to be racing towards something was now harder to read. By the spring of 323 BC, Alexander was back in Babylon, planning what would have been his most ambitious campaign yet. His scouts had been exploring the coastline of Arabia. He intended to circumnavigate the peninsula, establish ports and colonies along the route, open a direct sea trade between India and Egypt that would transform the commerce of the ancient world. Beyond Arabia, he spoke of further plans in the Western Mediterranean, perhaps even Carthage and Rome and Spain. The energy of the planning was enormous. Shipbuilders were constructing a new fleet. Harbors were being dug. Surveys were being organized. Engineers were designing canals. It was as though the grief over Hephaestion had been compressed into fuel for the next impossible project. Then, in late May of 323 BC, Alexander attended a banquet given by one of his companions, a Macedonian nobleman named Medius of Larissa. He drank heavily. He returned to his quarters that night feeling unwell. The next day, he was feverish. The day after that, he was worse. For 11 days, he lay in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, his fever climbing and refusing to break. The army outside grew increasingly agitated as news of his condition spread. They demanded to see him. Alexander was carried to a couch where he could be seen, and the soldiers filed past him in silence, each man looking at his face, many of them weeping. Alexander could no longer speak, but recognized them and acknowledged each with a slight movement of his eyes or his hand. He was asked, as the fever made it clear he would not recover, to whom he left his kingdom. His answer, if he gave one clearly, was recorded differently by different sources. Some say he whispered, "To the strongest." Others say he said, "To the best." Possibly he said nothing intelligible at all, and the words were supplied later by those who had reason to hear one thing or another in his final silence. Alexander the Great died on the 10th or 11th of June, 323 BC. He was 32 years old. He had ruled for 13 years. In that time, he had marched his army more than 20,000 miles, fought in a dozen major battles without losing a single one, founded more than 20 cities on 3 continents, and carved out the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. The empire he built did not survive him. His generals, the men who had followed him from Macedonia to the Hephaestus and back, immediately began fighting each other over the inheritance. They were called the Diadochi, the successors, and the wars they fought for control of Alexander's conquests lasted for decades and reshaped the entire eastern Mediterranean world. By the time the dust settled, the empire had been divided into several separate kingdoms, each ruled by a different Macedonian dynasty. But something more important than political geography survived. The world that Alexander created through his campaigns was a genuinely different world than the one that had existed before him. Greek language and Greek culture spread across the territories he had conquered, blending with Persian, Egyptian, Babylonian, and Indian traditions to create something new and richly complicated. This period, which historians call the Hellenistic Age, produced some of the most important intellectual and artistic achievements of antiquity. The city of Alexandria, The one he had sketched out on that Egyptian beach with handfuls of grain became exactly what he had perhaps imagined it might, a meeting point for the world's knowledge. The great library and museum established there by his successors became the intellectual center of the ancient world, housing hundreds of thousands of scrolls and attracting scholars from across the known world. Euclid worked out the foundations of geometry in Alexandria. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth there with remarkable accuracy. Archimedes studied there. The translation of Hebrew scripture into Greek, the Septuagint, was made there. The routes that Alexander's army had opened remained open. Trade between the Mediterranean and India, between Egypt and Persia, between Greece and Bactria, flowed along the roads and sea lanes his campaigns had mapped. Ideas traveled with the goods. Buddhist missionaries from India reached the courts of Greek kings in Bactria. Greek philosophical concepts filtered into Jewish and eventually Christian theology. Persian administrative practices shaped the governments of states that called themselves Greek. Even Alexander's physical appearance took on an afterlife of its own. The image of the young king, with his swept-back hair and his upward gaze and his slightly tilted head, was reproduced on coins and in statues across the entire eastern Mediterranean. Every king who came after him for centuries positioned himself relative to Alexander. Caesar wept famously when he saw a statue of Alexander in Spain, because at the age at which Alexander had already conquered the known world, Caesar had achieved nothing of note. Augustus kept a ring with Alexander's portrait as his personal seal. 2,300 years later, historians and scientists are still arguing about what killed Alexander the Great. The ancient sources record the symptoms clearly enough: fever, increasing weakness over 11 days, and a cessation of visible breathing before death. But the interpretation of those symptoms has generated one of the longest-running debates in ancient historical medicine. Typhoid fever, complicated by typhoid encephalopathy, remains the most widely accepted explanation. The bacterium Salmonella typhi was endemic in the ancient world, and the symptoms recorded align reasonably well with a severe typhoid infection. A 2019 study published in the journal Ancient History Bulletin proposed that Alexander may have actually survived in a state of ascending paralysis from Guillain-Barré syndrome for several days while appearing dead, which would explain the ancient reports that his body showed no sign of decomposition for 6 days after he apparently ceased breathing. Other theories have included poisoning, which was suspected by some contemporaries, particularly involving a substance called the water of Styx, a highly toxic natural seepage from limestone in the Arcadian mountains of Greece. There is at least one ancient source that names a specific person as having organized the poisoning: Aristotle, allegedly acting at the instigation of Antipater, who was Alexander's regent in Macedonia, and who had reason to fear replacement. Most historians consider this unlikely, but it cannot be entirely ruled out. Excessive alcohol consumption as a contributing factor has also been seriously considered. Alexander's drinking had increased markedly in the final years of his life, and the ancient sources suggest that his last illness began after a substantial drinking session. Liver disease from chronic alcohol use combined with an acute infection could account for the rapidity of his decline. His body, after death, became immediately the subject of political struggle. His generals fought over possession of the corpse with the same intensity they fought over territory, because control of Alexander's body conferred enormous legitimacy on whoever held it. Ptolemy, who would eventually become pharaoh of Egypt, intercepted the funeral cortege while it was en route to Macedonia and diverted it to Egypt. Alexander was buried first in Memphis and later in Alexandria, in a tomb that became one of the wonders of the ancient world, visited by everyone who mattered in the Mediterranean for centuries. Then, at some point in late antiquity, the tomb disappeared. No one knows when or why or where the body ended up. Dozens of researchers over the centuries have claimed to have found it. None of these claims has held up. The man who conquered the world and named cities after himself and his horse lies somewhere unknown in an unmarked resting place in a city that still bears his name. What keeps people returning to Alexander's story long after the battles have faded and the cities he founded have crumbled or been rebuilt beyond recognition is something harder to name than his military achievements or his political legacy. It is the quality of his inner life, the peculiar combination of boundless will and genuine vulnerability, of divine pretension and very human grief. He was a man who slept with Homer under his pillow and wept when there was no more world to conquer. He was a man who treated a defeated king's family with extraordinary gentleness and massacred the survivors of Tyre with cold efficiency. He was a man who built cities in the desert and drank himself into rages he could not control. He was a man who crossed mountains and deserts that defeated everyone who had tried before him, and then stopped at a river, because his soldiers were tired, and his heart was no longer fully in the advance. He was not a simple hero and not a simple tyrant. He was the product of an extraordinary education applied to an extraordinary natural endowment in an extraordinary historical moment with extraordinary consequences. He was also unmistakably a human being, subject to grief and loneliness and the particular pain of someone who has been told since childhood that they are destined for something that no ordinary human life can quite contain. The ancient biographer Plutarch, writing nearly 400 years after Alexander's death, understood this quality in him better than almost anyone. Plutarch was not writing history in the modern sense. He was writing lives, portraits, studies of character, as revealed through action. And what he saw in Alexander was not simply a conqueror, but a man in a constant struggle between the divine aspiration that drove him and the human limitations that constrained him. That struggle is why his story still resonates, not because we admire empire or conquest, though the scale of what he achieved is genuinely staggering, but because most of us understand, in some small and private way, what it feels like to be driven by something larger than the life available to you, to want to reach further than your arms extend, to grieve the people you love with a grief that embarrasses you by its size, to stand at the edge of what is known and feel the pull of the unknown, even when you are exhausted and there is no good reason to keep going. Alexander stood at the edge of the world and wept because he could not cross it. And then he turned around and went home. And the home he returned to was not the same home he had left, because the man who returned was not the same man who had departed. He had crossed too many rivers. He had seen too many horizons recede. He had buried too many friends in the soil of countries that had not yet been named. He died in Babylon, in a borrowed palace, in a city that was not his, planning a voyage that he would never make. He was 32 years old, and he had already outlived the scale of everything around him. Tonight, let that image carry you toward sleep. The young king in the lamplight, maps spread before him, one hand resting on the carved table, the city of Babylon breathing softly in the warm night outside. The future enormous and full of possibility, the past enormous and full of everything he had already done. And in the space between them, just a man, tired and brilliant, and grieving and alive, dreaming of the ocean at the edge of the world. Thank you for listening. If tonight's journey through the ancient world brought you some peace, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. It truly makes a difference to this little channel. Until next time, good night and sleep well.